Before Egypt had kings or gods, it had silence. A silence shaped by the breath of the Nile. Archaeologists call it prehistory, as if nothing remarkable had yet begun. But beneath the sand, fragments tell another story. Walls too straight, alignments too perfect, a design too intentional to be accident. If civilization truly began with the pharaohs, then who built the foundations they inherited? Tonight we return to the dawn before dynasties, to follow the whispers buried in clay and time and uncover the forgotten architects who shaped Egypt. Before Egypt began. Before the first hieroglyph was carved, before kings wore crowns of gold and granite, there was silence. A silence broken only by the slow breath of the Nile. 12,000 years ago, this land was not yet Egypt. It was a patchwork of rivers, grasslands, and shallow lakes stretching across what is now desert. The Sahara was green, alive with herds of gazelle, ostrich, and long-forgotten tribes who followed the rains like ghosts of an earlier Earth. Then, around 6000 BCE, the skies changed. The monsoons weakened. The fertile plains dried. What was once an ocean of grass hardened into the desert we know today. And in that great migration of climate, humanity itself began to move, pulled by the one force that still promised life, the Nile River. The Nile became a thread through time, a highway of survival. Along its banks, scattered communities began to gather. They built huts from reeds and clay, learned to store grain, and began to mark the passing of the floods. The river rose and fell like a clock of the gods, and through its rhythm, humans learned order. It was not yet civilization, but its heartbeat had begun. Archaeologists call these people the Bedarians, one of the earliest cultures of Upper Egypt, flourishing around 5000 BCE. Their tools were simple, but their imagination was not. They crafted pottery so fine it shimmered with a black-red polish, shaped with hands that already understood balance and symmetry. In their graves, we find offerings placed with care, proof of belief, ritual, and respect for the unseen. The Bedarians were not builders of monuments, but of meaning. They taught the land to remember. And from their soil, another name would rise: Nagada. Around 4400 BCE, the Bedarian culture began to evolve. New villages appeared farther south, near what is now Kenya. Here, something changed. Settlements grew larger. Houses gained walls of mud brick, and storage pits expanded into communal granaries. The people of Nagada were no longer simply farmers, they were planners. They were thinking in terms of structure, not only of shelter, but of society. To understand this moment, we have to imagine a world in transition. The Nile was no longer just a river, it was becoming a blueprint. Each flood left behind layers of fertile silt, and each season demanded coordination. Who would dig the canals? Who would measure the plots? Who would lead when the river turned violent? Necessity became architecture. The concept of alignment between people, between land and water, was born here, thousands of years before the first pyramid. Modern excavation at El Amra, Mahdi, and Kom El Ahmar shows the fingerprints of this transformation. Mud brick foundations reveal early attempts at urban planning, parallel walls, courtyards, storage zones. Some structures even show post holes aligned with celestial markers, suggesting that astronomy was already guiding design. In these early bricks, archaeologists see the faint geometry of the future, the same proportional logic that would one day define temples and tombs. But who taught them this sense of order? Some scholars argue it arose naturally. The predictable cycle of the Nile rewarded precision. Others suggest influence from older centers in the Levant or even Mesopotamia, pointing to traded goods found in Nagada graves, lapis from Afghanistan, obsidian from Anatolia, cedar from Lebanon. These objects tell a quiet story of connection, of ideas traveling alongside copper and stone, perhaps carrying with them the seeds of architectural thought. Yet there's a more mysterious possibility that these early Egyptians were inheriting knowledge far older than themselves. Every civilization begins somewhere, but not every beginning is a birth. Sometimes it is a remembrance. Around the same time, across the globe, similar awakenings were unfolding. The Ubaid of Mesopotamia, the Mehrgar of the Indus, the Jomon of Japan. Different continents, but the same moment, the rise of geometry, ritual, and construction. Could this be coincidence? Or the echo of a forgotten age, resurfacing after the chaos of the last ice age? The end of the Younger Dryas, 12,000 years ago, had erased coastlines and displaced countless peoples. What if the Nile Valley's first architects were descendants of survivors, bearers of knowledge salvaged from a drowned world? It remains speculation, but a haunting one, that Egypt's brilliance was not invented here, but reawakened here. The evidence is subtle, yet persistent. At Hierakonpolis, dated to around 4000 BCE, archaeologists found remains of a large ceremonial structure, post holes forming a perfect oval, suggesting both planning and symbolism. The same settlement contained mass breweries, capable of producing thousands of litres of beer, implying organised labour and large gatherings, perhaps the earliest communal festivals. This is not the image of primitive farmers. It is a society capable of design, coordination, and abstract vision, all the qualities that make an architect. As Nagada culture expanded, their art grew more symbolic. Vessels depict boats sailing under birds, animals arranged in ritual processions, and the first hints of kingship, a man holding the standards of power. In these motifs, we glimpse the birth of ideology, the union of architecture, art, and divinity. The same triad that would later define every temple and tomb of the pharaohs. By 3500 BCE, Egypt was no longer a scatter of villages. It was becoming a civilization in waiting. Hierakonpolis in the south, Maadi in the north, Abydos emerging in between. Three centres competing, learning, and exchanging ideas. Walls rose higher, tombs grew deeper. The idea of permanence, of stone replacing clay, began to take root. And in the quiet language of brick and line, Egypt was writing its prologue. When we think of Egypt today, we imagine pyramids, geometry on a cosmic scale. But to reach that, humanity first had to learn how to measure a shadow, how to stack a wall, how to read the rhythm of a river. The genius of the pharaohs was built upon the genius of the nameless, those who lived in mud and silence, but dreamed in symmetry. Standing on the banks of the Nile today, you can almost feel it, the pulse beneath the sand, the memory of a civilization learning how to see itself. Here, before kings and gods, the true architects of Egypt began their work, not in stone, but in time. When the rains left Africa, the Nile remained, a silver thread binding memory to survival. And along its banks, near the bend between desert cliffs and floodplain, a new world began to take shape. This was Nagada, a small settlement at first, but destined to become the womb of Egyptian civilization. Archaeologists divide this age into three chapters: Nagada, first, the second, and the third, spanning nearly a millennium from about 4400 to 3100 BCE. Each stage reveals not a static culture, but a civilization awakening, from clay huts to planned towns, from pottery art to social hierarchy, from communal burial to royal tomb. The story begins in the shadow of its predecessor, the Badarian culture. The Badarians had already shown Egypt how to farm, how to store food, and how to honour the dead. But it was the Nagada people who turned those humble practices into something far grander: organisation, craftsmanship, and vision. In their world, every action seemed guided by a quiet geometry, an intuition that form could serve both function and spirit. The first phase of Nagada, known as Amratian, was the age of experimentation. Here, mud brick replaced reed. Homes took on rectangular forms, oriented with the river. For the first time, we see evidence of communal storage structures, silos large enough to feed hundreds, and public areas suggesting coordinated planning. At sites like El Amra and Badari, early kilns and pottery workshops emerge. Their ceramics were more than containers. They were canvases of myth, red vessels painted with white boats, birds, and standards that would later appear on royal insignia. Even then they were learning to encode meaning into matter. Tools evolved too. Copper chisels and awls replaced stone flakes, marking the first steps toward metallurgy. From simple dwellings they began to craft shrines, enclosed spaces for rituals whose purpose we can only guess. But one thing is clear, they had started to build for eternity. Then came what scholars call the Girzian Revolution, the golden age of the pre-dynastic world. Settlements multiplied along the Nile. At Hierakonpolis to the south, artisans created colossal beer breweries and intricate ivory carvings. At Abydos, early cemeteries evolved into sacred landscapes. And at Nagada itself, evidence shows neighborhoods arranged by craft, potters, metalworkers, weavers, and priests, a society organized by skill and status. Trade connected them to distant worlds: obsidian from Ethiopia, lapis from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, shells from the Red Sea, each artifact a thread in a growing network of exchange. The Nile was no longer just a river, it was Egypt's first highway, carrying ideas as easily as goods. But something deeper was happening beneath the surface: the birth of hierarchy. Graves grew larger, more elaborate, and more unequal. While common people rested in simple pits, elites were buried with jewellery, decorated pottery, and sometimes human or animal sacrifices. Archaeologists at Nagada and Balas have uncovered early mastaba-like tombs, multi-roomed structures lined with brick, precursors to the royal tombs of Abydos. In the dust of these tombs lies a quiet revelation. Before pharaohs, there were already kings, local chieftains or proto-rulers who claimed divine right through architecture. Each new tomb was not merely a grave, but a declaration that death itself could be conquered through design. By the time of Nagada III, the transformation was complete. Villages had become proto-cities. Temples stood where huts once were, and for the first time, symbols began to speak. In a tomb at Abydos, labelled Tomb UJ, archaeologists discovered hundreds of small ivory tags, each etched with pictograms representing goods, places, and names. These were not decorations. They were records, the earliest known hieroglyphs in Egypt, centuries before the official script. A written language was being born, not from poetry, but from accounting, from the logic of administration that architecture itself reflected. Nearby, they found a wooden chest filled with jars of imported wine, over 700 vessels meticulously arranged. This was logistics on a monumental scale. To bury a man with so much abundance required coordination, craftsmanship, and reverence. Tomb UJ is not just an archaeological site. It's a mirror reflecting the emergence of centralized power, the embryonic state that would soon call itself Kemet. What makes the Nagada era so extraordinary is how quickly its architecture evolved. In less than 1,000 years, Egypt went from river huts to planned necropolises, a leap unmatched anywhere else in prehistory. The materials remained humble: mud brick, reeds, wood. But the intent changed. Structures were now symbolic. They encoded belief. The rectangular house became the model for the eternal tomb. The courtyard became the sacred enclosure. Later, when Djoser's step pyramid rose at Saqqara, it was merely a stone echo of a much older language, the architecture of Nagada. Archaeologists at Hierakonpolis have reconstructed a ceremonial temple, its layout eerily resembling later dynastic sanctuaries. Central axis, open court, inner chamber. Even the concept of the ka, the life force housed within stone, may have its origins here when the first shrines were designed to hold presence, not just shelter worship. Every generation of Nagada builders refined the proportions, the relationship between width, height, and orientation. It's here that the geometry of Egyptian architecture began, ratios derived not from mathematics but from observation, the horizon, the floodplain, the rising sun. They were mapping eternity with their eyes. But beyond tools and tombs, there was something harder to define, a mindset. The Nagada people saw no separation between the material and the divine. A wall could be both protection and prayer. A tomb could be both home and heaven. Their architecture was philosophy made solid, a belief that harmony with nature could transcend mortality. When you stand in the ruins of Nagada, Abydos, or Hierakonpolis, it's easy to forget how ancient they are. But these sites predate the pyramids by more than a millennium. Here, the first concept of order, ma'at, took physical form. The alignment of buildings, the symmetry of artifacts, the hierarchy of space, all mirrored the cosmic order that Egypt would later worship. Even in their art, this order is visible. Boats sailing toward the setting sun, animals arranged in pairs, human figures standing between heaven and earth. It is as if the entire culture was practicing, rehearsing the great symphony that would later be played in stone. And so, by 3100 BCE, as local chiefs united under one crown, the double kingdom of Upper and Lower Egypt, the blueprint was ready. The architects of Nagada had already written the grammar of Egyptian civilization. They had taught the Nile how to build. Today, the ruins of Nagada lie quiet, eroded by time, half buried beneath dust and modern villages. Few tourists come here, few documentaries mention its name. Yet without it, Egypt as we know it would never have existed. Every temple, every obelisk, every pyramid, all trace their lineage to these early walls of clay. Archaeologists still uncover surprises. In 2019, drone surveys revealed rectangular enclosures beneath the surface, aligned perfectly north-south, the same cosmic orientation later used at Giza. How could a people without compasses, without writing, without iron, achieve such precision? The question lingers like a riddle written in mud. Perhaps they remembered something older, a geometry whispered through generations. Perhaps the Nile itself taught them, the curve of its floodplain forming the first natural compass. Or perhaps, as some legends suggest, they carried fragments of knowledge from a world that came before the flood. A civilization erased, but not forgotten. Whatever the truth, the architects of Nagada achieved something profound. They turned survival into structure, ritual into design, and time into architecture. And in doing so, they laid the foundations not just for Egypt, but for the very idea of civilization. Every civilization begins with a rhythm. For Egypt, that rhythm was water. Each year, like clockwork, the Nile swelled from the rains of distant Ethiopia, spilling life across the valley. When the waters receded, they left behind a black skin of fertile silt, rich, silent, and waiting. To the people who lived along its banks, this was not a flood. It was a heartbeat, the pulse of the earth itself. But that heartbeat had to be understood. And understanding it required pattern, measurement, and memory, the very tools that would one day define Egyptian architecture. Long before temples and pyramids, the Nile was the first architect. It taught proportion, how high the banks must rise, how far the walls must stretch, how deep the canals must be dug. Every flood was a lesson in geometry, every drought a test in endurance. By 5000 BCE, the African humid period had ended. The once green Sahara was turning to dust. Nomadic tribes retreated toward the river, seeking its constant rhythm. Villages began to cluster along its edges, their lives dictated by the ebb and flow of the water. The Nile became not just a source of sustenance, but a map of destiny, a corridor of order carved through chaos. From this necessity grew ingenuity. The early farmers of Madi, Fayoum, and Hierakonpolis learned to build basins, levees, and channels to harness the annual flood. They began measuring the heights of the river with simple markers, precursors to the later Nilometers. These were more than tools. They were the first scientific instruments of Egypt, born from the desire to predict the divine. The act of controlling water became the act of creating civilization, and with it emerged a new idea that the world could be shaped, not merely endured. But the Nile's generosity was fragile. As the desert advanced, rainfall dwindled, forcing populations to adapt or vanish. Archaeological layers show periods of drought punctuating the pre-dynastic timeline, moments when settlements shrank and trade routes shifted. These environmental stresses acted as a crucible, refining human organization. At Kom Ombo and Nekhen, evidence suggests that communities pooled resources during lean years, sharing granaries, coordinating harvests, building storage systems that required cooperation. From survival emerged structure, and from structure, hierarchy. Architecture became both a record and a response. Walls to protect grain, enclosures to manage cattle, dikes to tame floods. Each new construction represented collective memory, the translation of seasonal rhythm into enduring form. Climate, more than conquest, was the first unifier of Egypt. The shared struggle against the river's unpredictability created a common calendar, a shared language of measurement, and eventually a shared belief in divine balance, what the later Egyptians would call Ma'at. As the land dried, so too did isolation. The Nile became a lifeline not only for water, but for connection. Boats carved from acacia and papyrus glided along its surface, linking settlements hundreds of kilometers apart. This was Egypt's first highway of stone and reed, the origin of commerce, communication, and culture. Artifacts found in Nagada II graves tell of a world far wider than the Nile Valley alone. Obsidian blades from Ethiopia, copper tools from Sinai, lapis lazuli beads from Afghanistan, cedar wood from Byblos. These were not the possessions of wanderers, they were the symbols of a civilization learning to reach beyond its horizon. Trade was more than exchange. It was translation. Each imported material carried with it ideas, new techniques, new beliefs, new aesthetics. The curved hulls of Mesopotamian boats may have inspired Egypt's river vessels. The standardized pottery of the Levant may have seeded Egypt's own sense of proportion. And through these networks, perhaps even the first whispers of sacred architecture, temples aligned to stars, altars built to echo heaven, drifted upstream to the valley. But the Nile did not simply receive. It transformed. What it absorbed from others, it made eternal. The people of early Egypt watched the river as they watched the heavens. They noticed that the flood's arrival coincided with the rising of a single star, Sirius, the soul of Isis. From that moment, astronomy became agriculture, and agriculture became architecture. Alignment was no longer just practical, it was cosmic. Villages and enclosures began to orient themselves with celestial precision, east-west, north-south, in harmony with both sun and flood. The act of building became a ritual reenactment of creation. Each wall, each foundation, a microcosm of the universe's order. At Hierakonpolis, post holes from a ceremonial structure form an almost perfect oval, interpreted by some as a solar enclosure, a sacred symbol of rebirth. At Abydos, early tombs already mirror cardinal directions, prefiguring the precise alignments of the Old Kingdom pyramids. Even in the smallest shrines, archaeologists have detected traces of astronomical planning, proof that the Nile's rhythm had become encoded in architecture. By 3500 BCE, the Nile had given Egypt its identity, both physical and spiritual. Its floods demanded cooperation, its fertility allowed surplus, and its constancy invited reflection. The people began to think in cycles, not moments, in permanence, not impermanence. And so, they began to build accordingly. Architecture became a calendar in stone. Walls marked seasons. Courtyards aligned with solstices. Storage chambers mirrored the pattern of the stars. Each structure was an equation, balancing heaven and earth, chaos and control. The Egyptian concept of order, ma'at, was born from this logic. It was not merely a moral principle, but an architectural one. To live in harmony with the Nile was to build in harmony with the cosmos. To violate its rhythm was to invite collapse. In this sense, the Nile was not just a river. It was a teacher of proportion, balance, and continuity, the very foundation upon which every later temple, pyramid, and tomb would rest. The growing prosperity along the river led to competition and cooperation between settlements. Three centres began to dominate: Hierakonpolis in the south, Abydos in the centre, and Maadi in the north. Each served a different role: religious, ceremonial, and commercial. Hierakonpolis built monuments of worship. Abydos built monuments of remembrance. Maadi built networks of exchange. Between them flowed not only the river, but the current of identity. Out of these three would rise the idea of Upper and Lower Egypt, two lands mirrored by one river, a duality that would define Egyptian symbolism forever. Archaeological traces show early attempts at unification: identical pottery styles, shared iconography, standardized weights. It was as if the Nile itself was sculpting its people into one rhythm, preparing them for the coming of kings. Every flood carved patience into the people's bones. Every harvest demanded precision. Over centuries, this repetition became culture. And culture became law, not the law of rulers, but of rhythm. The Egyptians learned that to survive, they had to synchronize with each other, with the river, with the sky. From that synchronization came mathematics, calendars, bureaucracy, and the architectural order that would soon astonish the world. The step from riverbank to temple wall was not a leap, but a continuation. Each line drawn in clay echoed the river's curve. Each measured foundation echoed the sun's path. To build was to remember the Nile. Even now, when satellites map the Nile's ancient floodplains, they reveal faint ghost lines beneath the sand, the foundations of lost settlements, irrigation grids, and causeways stretching for miles. These patterns match the geometry of later dynastic temples. The continuity is undeniable. The river that taught humanity to count its seasons also taught it to count its stones. And so, before Egypt ever called itself a kingdom, it was already a system, an alignment between nature and mind. The Nile had awakened both, turning chaos into cadence, survival into civilization. In the clay of Nagada, hands began to remember what the mind had not yet learned. They moulded mud into form, long before dynasties knew how to measure stone. Yet some of these early walls show precision no primitive culture should possess. Were they experiments of a rising people, or echoes of a knowledge carried from a forgotten age? Before Egypt was carved from stone, it was shaped by clay. And before architects drew their lines in granite, they learned to trace them in mud. In the heart of the Nile Valley, around 3800 BCE, the people of Nagada began an experiment that would change the course of human design. They discovered that the very earth beneath their feet, when moulded, dried, and aligned, could hold not only weight, but meaning. What they built from it would become the prototype for everything that followed: homes, temples, tombs, and ultimately civilization itself. Mud brick. It seems humble, fragile, even disposable. But in Egypt, it was eternal. The Nile's silt, rich with minerals and straw, became the genetic code of architecture, the medium through which the Nagada builders first learned to shape permanence from impermanence. In the settlements of Nagada, Hierakonpolis, and Maadi, archaeologists have uncovered layers of ancient brickwork still visible beneath the sand. Walls once plastered smooth, courtyards traced with ash, doorways reinforced by timber. Their bricks were made not by accident, but by formula, a precise ratio of clay to chaff to water, pressed into wooden moulds, dried in the sun, and stacked with astonishing uniformity. These were the fingerprints of planning, the earliest standardization of construction in human history. What began as protection against the flood became a philosophy of form. Each layer of brick mirrored the annual deposit of silt left by the Nile, one upon another, year after year, as if the land itself was teaching its builders how to remember. To build in Egypt was to imitate nature, to record the river's rhythm in architecture. In their houses, the Nagada people rehearsed the geometry that would later define temples and tombs. Rectangular layouts, internal courtyards, axial entrances. These were not random conveniences, but deliberate patterns. The doorway always faced the rising sun. The hearth sat at the centre, like the heart of a household cosmos. Even in simplicity, there was symbolism. At Kom el Ahmar, excavations revealed clusters of houses arranged along straight lines, proto-streets, a level of spatial organisation unmatched elsewhere in Africa at that time. Some homes shared walls, others opened onto communal yards. There were storage zones, animal pens, and workshops for pottery and copper. It was a city in embryo, every structure a note in a larger harmony. To the modern eye, these ruins seem crude. But hidden in their proportions is the seed of Egyptian symmetry, the same principles of order and balance that would one day guide the hands of pyramid masons. What began in clay would eventually be immortalized in stone. We often speak of kings and priests, but the first architects of Egypt were artisans, anonymous hands hardened by heat and dust. They worked without titles, guided only by intuition and the pulse of the river. They knew when the silt was too wet, when the straw was too coarse, when the sun had baked long enough. Their mastery was empirical, born not from mathematics, but from memory. Archaeological remains show clear divisions of labour. Potters, brickmakers, plasterers, painters, and overseers who coordinated supply and layout. This indicates not just craft, but management, an early form of project organisation, the embryo of state-level engineering. At Hierakonpolis, the largest pre-dynastic settlement yet discovered, workers constructed a massive mud brick enclosure, known today as Fort HK29A. Its walls once stood 7 metres high, enclosing a ceremonial space where rituals of kingship were likely performed. The bricks are perfectly aligned, alternating headers and stretchers, a technique that reappears, almost unchanged, in Old Kingdom temples 1,500 years later. To stand before these weathered remnants is to glimpse the training ground of Imhotep's ancestors. The builders of Nagada were not only engineers, they were philosophers in motion. For them, architecture was inseparable from spirituality. To raise a wall was to create order from chaos, echoing the myth of Atum, the first god rising from the waters of Nun. Within many Nagada settlements, small shrines have been found, rectangular platforms of brick, sometimes surrounded by reed matting, sometimes crowned with animal skulls or carved figurines. These were proto-temples, sanctuaries dedicated to forces not yet named: fertility, flood, fire, and sky. Here, architecture became ritual. The very act of building was prayer. At Hierakonpolis, archaeologists discovered a shrine containing rows of carved ivory figurines, dancers, priests, and animals, buried beneath a layer of ash and pottery. This was no random deposit. It was a foundation ritual, the world's oldest known example of symbolic cornerstone offerings. Long before the pyramids, These builders were consecrating space, dedicating it to eternity. As populations grew, so did ambition. By Nagada the Sen, c. 3800–3300 BCE, entire neighborhoods were devoted to production, pottery kilns glowing red in the night, copper furnaces ringing like bells, workshops carving ivory and bone into tools and idols. These were not isolated crafts, they were orchestrated systems, coordinated for trade and ceremony alike. Along the Nile, the flow of goods mirrored the flow of ideas. Builders learned to reinforce foundations against the flood, to plaster walls for insulation, to shape vaulted ceilings for strength. In some sites, archaeologists found evidence of painted facades, red ochre patterns imitating reed mats, turning everyday buildings into symbols of prestige. The line between function and art began to blur. At El Mahasna, remnants of a large mud brick structure reveal a striking feature: recessed wall patterns, niches alternating between projection and shadow. This design, called palace facade architecture, would become the hallmark of royal tombs and the step pyramid itself. Here, in the dust of a forgotten town, the aesthetic of kingship was born. By 3500 BCE, the Nagada world was entering its golden phase. Settlements expanded into true proto-cities, covering tens of hectares. Roadways appeared, delineated by brick and stone. Granaries formed centralized storage complexes. Early bureaucratic architecture. At Hierakonpolis, massive breweries produced thousands of litres of beer, likely for festivals and state feasts. Scale itself had become sacred. The architects of clay were learning a profound truth: that design could command people as surely as kings could. A wall could define a hierarchy. An enclosure could shape belief. Architecture was becoming the language of power, and yet their works were never meant to dominate nature. They followed the river's rhythm, respecting its cycles, mirroring its balance. Where Mesopotamia built ziggurats to reach the heavens, Egypt built along the Nile to align with eternity. Clay is fragile, but the mind that shaped it was not. The Nagada builders understood that no material truly lasts. Only the idea within it does. Their mud brick towns crumbled within centuries, but their designs survived, transferred to stone, copied by generations of craftsmen who never knew their names. It's here that Egypt's architectural philosophy took root, that every structure is a reflection of cosmic order, that every measurement is a prayer to balance, that permanence is not achieved through hardness, but through harmony. Later dynasties would credit their monuments to gods and pharaohs, but the foundation belonged to these early artisans, the silent engineers who first learned to translate time into form. If Nagada was the cradle of Egypt's architecture, then Hierakonpolis was its awakening, the first city where clay became civilization. Here, around 3800 BCE, the scattered rhythms of the Nile converged into a single pulse, the pulse of organized society, of labor and ceremony, of vision and power, the city of the hawk. The ancients called it Nekhen, the city of the hawk, sacred to Horus, the falcon god who would later become the divine symbol of kingship. Long before he appeared on royal crowns, his presence ruled this place. Hierakonpolis was not just a settlement, it was a revelation, the first fusion of architecture, ritual, and state. Stretching across the floodplain of Upper Egypt, Hierakonpolis covered more than 50 hectares, vast for its time. Its streets were aligned with purpose, its quarters divided by craft. Potters here, brewers there, artisans, priests, and rulers each within their own defined space. It was in every sense a designed city, a living diagram of order. Archaeologists have uncovered remains of mud brick walls, courtyards, and workshops, all radiating from a central ceremonial core. At the heart stood a temple, one of the oldest in human history, a sanctuary of timber and brick that predated the great temples of Karnak by 2 millennia. Though the structure is long gone, the post holes and foundations reveal an organized symmetry, a blueprint echoed later in stone. The Temple of Horus. This early temple, known as Structure HK29A, was the soul of Hierakonpolis. Built and rebuilt over centuries, it served as a place of ritual, governance, and astronomical alignment. Its axis faced the rising sun, its walls adorned with symbolic offerings, its floors layered with generations of sacred renewal. Here, the concept of temple as cosmos was born, the idea that architecture could embody creation itself. Each post hole marked not only a column, but a star. Each wall represented the boundary between the known and the eternal. To walk through its gateway was to cross from human time into divine order. Archaeologists discovered within its remains fragments of ceremonial objects, stone pallets, carved ivory figures, animal bones arranged with ritual precision. Among them, one image stands out: a falcon perched atop a shrine, wings outstretched. It is the earliest known depiction of Horus, and perhaps the earliest expression of kingship in all of Egypt. This temple was more than a building, it was a declaration. Through it, the people of Hierakonpolis proclaimed that the divine could dwell among them, that power could be anchored in architecture. Yet Hierakonpolis was not only holy, it was industrious. Surrounding the temple were vast production zones, pottery kilns, copper workshops, and above all, enormous breweries. Excavations at HK11C revealed circular vats and clay furnaces capable of brewing more than 4,000 litres of beer at once, industrial scale, 5,000 years before modern civilization. The beer was likely used for festivals and ritual feasts offered to both gods and the community. It represented unity, the sharing of abundance, the synchronization of labor and celebration. To build such facilities required coordination, specialized workers, resource management and storage systems, the architecture of administration. Here, in the scent of molten smoke, bureaucracy was born. Each vat, each wall, each platform was part of a system. The people of Hierakonpolis had turned space into strategy, proof that architecture could organize not just matter, but society itself. The tombs of power. Just beyond the city's walls lay another realm, the elite cemetery, known to archaeologists as HK6. Here, the rulers and priests of Hierakonpolis were buried in brick-lined chambers, surrounded by offerings, ivory carvings, and the bones of sacrificed animals. Some tombs contain the remains of attendants, men and women buried alongside their masters, an early manifestation of Egypt's belief that the afterlife mirrored life itself. One tomb in particular, Tomb 100, has astonished researchers. Its walls once bore the earliest known painted mural in Egypt, scenes of boats, dancers, warriors, and a ruler smiting his enemies beneath the wings of Horus. It is both art and declaration, the first visual narrative of divine kingship. What the palette of Nama would later carve in stone, Tomb 100 had already painted in clay. These tombs mark a turning point. Death became an architectural statement. Through design, the elite claimed continuity, the promise that structure itself could defeat decay. As Hierakonpolis grew, its rulers sought to protect and project their power. In its northern quarter, around 3400 BCE, the people of Nagada II built the ceremonial precinct HK29A, a vast open complex of wood and mud brick walls where rituals once bound the community together. Centuries later, near the same sacred ground, King Khasekhemwy would raise a far grander structure, the mud brick fort of Hierakonpolis. Its walls, nearly 4 meters thick, enclosed a rectangle 50 by 60 meters, perfectly aligned to the cardinal points. Though built long after the first architects of Nagada, its design echoed their spirit, symmetry, permanence, and cosmic order. It was not defense, it was memory, solidified. The fort stood as the last echo of a vision first dreamed 1,000 years earlier, the dream of turning Earth into eternity. Its corners are approximately aligned with the cardinal directions, a precision that foreshadows the alignments of Saqqara and Giza. The scale of its construction, organized labor, measured proportions, centralized control, reveals a society already capable of state-level coordination. Hierakonpolis had become more than a city. It had become a prototype for the Egyptian state. Rituals of unification. Every year, the people gathered at the temple to perform rituals honoring Horus, rituals of renewal, fertility, and kingship. The priests carried standards topped with falcons and serpents, precursors to the royal insignia. Through song, dance, and offering, they reenacted the cosmic struggle between order and chaos, a story that would later define Egyptian theology. It is possible that these ceremonies symbolized more than faith. Perhaps they prefigured political unity. In the processions of Hierakonpolis, one can already see the idea of two lands, one crown taking form. When the Nama palette later depicted the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, it was not inventing a myth, it was preserving a memory. If Hierakonpolis was the heart of the living, Abydos was the gate of eternity. Here, at the edge of the desert, where the fertile black soil of the Nile met the red sands of the west, Egypt learned to build for death, and in doing so, it learned to build forever. Abydos is older than kingship itself. Long before it became the burial ground of pharaohs, it was a sanctuary, a place where life and afterlife touched. To the early Egyptians, the setting sun vanished beyond these cliffs, descending into the realm of the dead. To bury someone here was to send them directly into the western horizon, the womb of rebirth. Archaeological evidence shows that as early as 4000 BCE, Abydos was already sacred. Small graves lined the ridges, simple at first, oval pits covered with reed mats or mud brick caps. But within a few centuries they grew larger, deeper, and more elaborate. Walls thickened, chambers multiplied, offerings increased. Death had become architecture. At a place now called el-Ka'ab, meaning Mother of Pots, a cluster of tombs marks the rise of power. It was here that the rulers of Nagada III and the early dynasties were buried, the ancestors of Egypt's first kings. Each tomb was a world unto itself, chambers lined with brick, ceilings supported by wooden beams, floors paved with imported stone. Graves of attendants surrounded the main chamber, suggesting that when a ruler died, his court followed him into the next life. Thousands of pottery jars, once filled with wine and oil, were stacked like offerings to eternity. Even after 5,000 years, their fragments still litter the sand, the shards of vanished ceremonies. Among these tombs lies Tomb Uj, the resting place of a mysterious ruler archaeologists call the Scorpion King. Inside they found something unprecedented. Hundreds of ivory tags, each etched with early pictograms representing goods, places, and offerings. This was more than decoration, it was administration. Each symbol recorded an item or a shipment, perhaps the earliest evidence of written language in Egypt. Writing, it seems, was born not in palaces but in tombs, born from the desire to organize eternity. The builders of Abydos did not merely bury the dead, they designed entire landscapes of remembrance. Tombs were aligned with precision, often facing north or west, directions tied to the stars and the path of the sun. Nearby, ceremonial enclosures rose from the sand, walled courts of mud brick where rituals of ascension took place. One such structure, known as Shunit el-Zabib, still stands today. 4,000 years of wind have stripped its surface, but its form endures, a rectangular fortress of clay, its walls rising nearly 12 meters high. It was built by King Hierakonpolis around 2700 BCE, but its design is older, a direct descendant of pre-dynastic prototypes. The alternating recesses and projections along its walls, known as palace facade architecture, first appeared here at Abydos centuries earlier. These motifs would later echo in every royal monument, from Djoser's step pyramid to the great complexes of Giza. The language of stone began as the language of mud brick, and its grammar was first written in this desert. To the people of Abydos, architecture was not inert, it was alive. A tomb was not a container for the dead, but a machine of transformation, designed to guide the soul from earth to sky. Every wall, every chamber, every passage carried symbolic purpose. The burial pit represented the womb of the goddess Nut. The ceiling, often painted black and dotted with stars, symbolized the night sky. The doorway between chambers was the threshold of becoming, a passage from mortality into divinity. In this new architecture of power, geometry became theology. The square was the earth, the circle the sky, and the diagonal the path of the spirit ascending. By shaping space, the Egyptians believed they could shape eternity itself. The ruler's tomb was not merely a dwelling for the dead, it was an announcement to the cosmos. I will not be forgotten. I have measured time. Behind this vision stood the same artisans who once built homes of clay in Nagada and temples in Hierakonpolis. Generations of anonymous builders carried their craft into the desert, now serving gods instead of kings, or perhaps kings who had become gods. Excavations reveal organized workshops near the Abydos necropolis, areas for brick production, wood carving, and pottery. Architectural plans became increasingly standardized, suggesting that teams of specialists worked from shared templates. This was no longer the work of individuals. It was state architecture, designed and executed with collective precision. Every structure was aligned with astronomical and topographical markers: the rising sun, the path of Orion, the curve of the Wadi. Each alignment tied the ruler's soul to cosmic motion, ensuring his participation in the eternal cycle. Among the most remarkable discoveries at Abydos are the royal boats, wooden vessels buried beside the tombs, preserved in sand for over 5 millennia. They range from small rivercraft to ships over 20 meters long, complete with planks, cabins, and oar slots. Their purpose remains debated. Were they symbolic vehicles for the king's soul, or real ships that once sailed the Nile? Either way, their meaning is unmistakable. In Egyptian belief, the sun god Ra travelled the heavens by boat, one for day, one for night. To be buried with boats was to share that divine journey, to cross the waters of the afterlife as Ra crossed the sky. Architecture and myth had become one. The tomb was the earth, the boat was the sun, and the ruler was the axis that bound them. Each royal burial was accompanied by elaborate rites. Animals, cattle, gazelles, dogs, were sacrificed and placed beside their masters. Servants, too, were buried in adjacent graves, their lives offered to maintain the king's household in the next world. This grim devotion testifies to the power of belief, that death was not an end, but a transformation through structure and ceremony. Around the necropolis, archaeologists found processional pathways paved with crushed limestone, leading from the riverbank to the tombs. Along these routes, priests and mourners carried the royal body, reenacting the cosmic voyage from life to eternity. Each funeral was both a farewell and a renewal, the reaffirmation that through architecture, order conquered chaos. By the dawn of the First Dynasty, Abydos had become the spiritual capital of Egypt. Kings like Nama, Aha, and Jer were buried here, continuing the lineage begun by the Scorpion King. Even as the political center shifted north to Memphis, Abydos remained the heart of remembrance. Later dynasties returned to build temples to Osiris, god of resurrection, whose myth was rooted in this very soil. In Egyptian thought, Osiris was the first to die and be reborn, a divine echo of the earliest rulers who had sought the same through their tombs. Abydos thus became both origin and destination, the beginning of Egypt's obsession with eternity. Every pyramid, every temple, every burial shaft would trace its spiritual lineage back to this place, where the living first learned to build for the dead. In Abydos, architecture and authority became indistinguishable. To rule was to build. To build was to proclaim dominion not just over land, but over time itself. The tomb became a tool of propaganda, a statement that power transcends death, that the ruler's presence endures in form and geometry. This was the birth of what scholars call the ideology of kingship, the belief that order flows from the ruler as the Nile flows from its source. Through architecture, this idea became visible, tangible, unchallengeable. From the mud brick enclosures of Abydos, a straight line leads to the limestone terraces of Giza, from memory to monument, from mortality to myth. Today, the wind sweeps through Abydos, whispering across 5,000 years of silence. The desert still hides many secrets. Undiscovered chambers, buried causeways, forgotten shrines. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed anomalies beneath the sand, rectangles and corridors that suggest there is far more to this necropolis than we yet know. Perhaps whole temples remain beneath the dunes, their foundations still holding the weight of prayers whispered by vanished builders. Then the river awoke, and with it, order. Villages merged into cities, chaos into pattern, faith into architecture. But within Hierakonpolis, Egypt's first city of light, we find ruins that feel too complete, too advanced for their supposed time. Did civilization truly evolve step by step, or was it remembering how to build the world it had already lost? Civilizations do not unite by accident. They converge through symbols, through something that can be seen, touched, and shared. For Egypt, that symbol was architecture. By the late 4th millennium BCE, the people of the Nile no longer saw themselves as scattered settlements or rival tribes. They began to sense a larger identity, an invisible thread connecting the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, the valley and the delta, the lotus and the papyrus. And that thread was built, not spoken. The division of Egypt was both natural and spiritual. The delta, in the north, was a maze of waterways, fertile, fragmented, and open to the Mediterranean. The valley in the south was narrow and disciplined, bound by cliffs and the rhythm of the flood. Two environments, two mentalities, one fluid, one solid, one feminine, one masculine. Between them flowed the Nile, binding opposites into balance. The early rulers of Nagada III understood this duality. They saw that to unite the land, they needed more than conquest. They needed a common language, one that transcended words and bloodlines. And so they built it. From Abydos in the south to Maadi in the north, construction began to follow the same grammar: rectilinear plans, standardized brick sizes, north-south orientations, and the use of recessed facades, all hallmarks of a single aesthetic vision. Even pottery forms and building proportions mirrored each other across hundreds of kilometers. This was not coincidence. It was communication through form. Archaeologists believe this architectural uniformity reflects the rise of centralized authority, the first step toward unification. To build alike is to think alike, and to think alike is to belong. In Hierakonpolis, temples grew in scale. In Abydos, tombs aligned to stars. In Buto and Maadi, northern centers adopted southern styles. Across the Nile, the landscape itself was being rewritten, transformed into a script of unity. Egypt was learning to see itself as one continuous design. Before Nama, there were other rulers, shadowy figures known from fragments of ivory and stone. Scorpion I, Scorpion II, Ka, Irie Hor. Their names are scratched onto ceremonial maces and vessels, their tombs scattered across Abydos and Hierakonpolis. Each left behind the same architectural signature: large mud-brick tombs surrounded by enclosures, oriented to the stars. Each claimed dominion not through armies, but through alignment, the ability to order space, to impose cosmic geometry on the land. One of these rulers, known as King Scorpion II, is depicted on a ceremonial mace head found at Hierakonpolis. He wears the white crown of Upper Egypt and holds a hoe, not a weapon, but a tool of construction, cutting the first furrow of the land. It is the earliest image of kingship in the world, leadership not as war, but as creation. To rule was to build was to bring order. Around 3100 BCE, this vision reached fulfillment under Narmer, the legendary king who unified the two lands. His victory is immortalized on a slab of stone, the Narmer palette found at Hierakonpolis. On one side he wears the white crown of Upper Egypt, on the other the red crown of Lower Egypt. Between them a single falcon, Horus, symbolizes divine kingship. It is not just a record of conquest, but a manifesto of architecture. Look closely, and the palette's composition mirrors the symmetry of temples: vertical axis, balanced figures, enclosed scenes. Its imagery is spatial, built like a structure. Even the hieroglyphic layout resembles the facades of ceremonial enclosures. The message is clear: the same order that unites art also unites the world. Through design, Narmer proclaimed what would become Egypt's eternal ideology, Ma'at, the divine balance between chaos and order, mirrored in every wall and column ever raised. Once the two lands were united, architecture became the instrument of governance. Temples, storage houses, and administrative centres multiplied along the Nile, built according to a standardized plan. For the first time, buildings were labelled with royal inscriptions, marking ownership and control. The architecture of community had become the architecture of state. The king's residence, the palace facade design seen at Abydos, was replicated in shrines and tombs across the country. Its alternating recesses symbolized rhythm and hierarchy, the breathing of structure, the balance of power. Even in death, the ruler's house was repeated in his tomb, ensuring that the geometry of rule continued into eternity. From these palaces emerged bureaucratic architecture, storerooms with counting marks, walls with tally symbols, and sealed containers labelled with the king's name. Every space was both functional and symbolic, a physical embodiment of control. To achieve such coordination, Egypt required organisation on a new scale. Teams of architects, surveyors, and labourers travelled under royal supervision, erecting identical complexes from south to north. This was the birth of the state architect, the intermediary between vision and matter, between the divine and the human. His tools were rope, plumb, and eye, yet through them he aligned kingdoms. Even before dynastic Egypt formally began, the very process of construction had become a political ritual. Every brick placed in unison was a statement of belonging. Every wall that mirrored another was an act of allegiance. The builders were not merely workers, they were the first citizens of a nation built from proportion. Alignment became Egypt's invisible constitution. To build facing north was to honour the stars. To build facing east was to greet the sun. To align two cities on a single axis was to link heaven and earth. Across hundreds of kilometres, temples, tombs, and settlements began to share celestial reference points. The land itself became a cosmic map. The unification of Egypt, therefore, was not only political, it was astronomical. Architecture served as the mediator between the terrestrial and the divine, binding the two lands under one sky. The crown symbolized rule. The alignment symbolized eternity. At Abydos, this new power found its monumental voice. Kings of the first dynasty, like Aha and Jer, built massive funerary enclosures, rectangular walls of brick enclosing vast open spaces. Inside, rituals of rebirth and accession were performed, connecting the ruler to both his ancestors and the gods. These enclosures were more than monuments. They were ritual theatres, spaces where myth and state merged. In their geometry, we see the foundation of later temple courtyards and pylons. Each gate, each wall, each orientation carried the memory of unity, the fusion of opposites into order. By the dawn of the First Dynasty, Egypt was no longer just a place. It was a design, a network of geometry, belief, and governance. From the Delta to the First Cataract, the same proportions ruled, the same measurements, the same ideology, the same devotion to symmetry. Architecture became the first state language, one understood by all, even those who could not read. When a new ruler took the throne, his first act was not proclamation, but construction. Each building was a sentence in the ongoing dialogue between heaven and earth, king and cosmos. In this sense, Egypt's unity was not written in laws, but in lines. Every civilization reaches a threshold, a moment when its materials no longer match its ambitions. For Egypt, that moment came when clay met stone, and those who bridged that divide became the first engineers of the world. By 3100 BCE, Egypt had unified under one crown. The nation was stable, prosperous, and organized. The rulers of the First and Second Dynasties now sought something that clay could no longer promise: permanence. Mud brick had built the memory of Nagada, but it eroded with every flood, every century of sun. If kings were divine, their monuments could not decay. The age of stone had begun. We do not know their names, the builders who first dared to carve the desert. They lived between worlds, inheritors of the Nagada tradition, yet pioneers of something entirely new. They left behind no biographies, only tool marks. But those marks speak a universal language: precision, patience, and understanding of geometry centuries ahead of their time. At Abydos, beneath the sand of el-Ka'ab, archaeologists have found quarry pits, ramps, and cut limestone blocks, suggesting that early dynastic tombs were already experimenting with stone architecture. These were not small steps. They were revolutions in material science. To cut and transport limestone required tools of copper, stone, and possibly harder alloys, technologies whose development remains poorly understood. Fragments of copper chisels have been found near Saqqara and Tarkhan, their edges still faintly gleaming. Under microscopes, the grooves they left behind on limestone surfaces reveal extraordinary control. Straight parallel lines consistent with rotary abrasion, as if the builders already knew how to drill and polish with mechanical precision. The earliest known attempts to build in stone appear at Saqqara, in what archaeologists call proto-mastabas, low rectangular structures made of both mud brick and limestone. These were the first hybrids: clay for structure, stone for skin. The builders were learning how the new material behaved, how it fractured, how it carried weight, how sunlight played across its surface. They discovered that stone could be polished to reflect light like water, a revelation that would shape the aesthetic of every temple to come. To the Egyptians, this transition was not just practical, it was metaphysical. Clay came from the Nile, soft, mutable, living. Stone came from the desert, hard, eternal, celestial. By combining them, the builders were uniting life and death, earth and sky, mortality and divinity. Each new block was an act of creation, the first step toward transforming architecture into theology. The leap from clay to stone required more than strength. It required mathematics. Mud brick could be shaped by eye, but stone demanded precision, and so the Egyptians invented it. They developed the cubit, a standardized unit based on the forearm's length, roughly 52 centimeters. A simple measure, but profound in its implication. It turned the human body into a cosmic scale. Every temple, every tomb, every pyramid that followed would be measured by this human constant, the perfect bridge between mortal and divine proportion. At Abydos, survey lines etched into bedrock show how builders aligned foundations using stretch cords and plumb lines. These tools, simple yet ingenious, allowed them to draw perfect right angles and straight baselines without modern equipment. Later, the Greeks would call this process harpedonaptai, rope stretching, but it began here, among the forgotten engineers of early Egypt. To build in stone meant to think in stone, and so the first royal engineers turned their gaze to the quarries of Aswan, Gebel el-Silsila, and Tura. They learned to follow natural fractures, to exploit the geometry hidden within rock. In these quarries, ancient channels and wedge marks still trace the rhythm of their labour. Rhythmic, deliberate, almost musical. Some cuts are so precise they suggest copper saws with abrasive sand, possibly even early forms of tubular drilling. The surfaces they left are flat, polished, and mathematically consistent, qualities far beyond what simple hammering could achieve. It is here that modern engineers pause and wonder, how could a people working with copper and stone produce such precision, rivaling tolerances we associate with metal machining? Perhaps they understood something we no longer do, not technology in our sense, but a deep harmony between material, vibration, and geometry. Each strike, each abrasion, each alignment, part of a ritual dialogue between human intent and natural order. By the reign of King Jer and King Den of the First Dynasty, architecture had reached new sophistication. Their tombs at Abydos were no longer simple pits, but multi-chambered complexes with stone doorframes, wooden ceilings, and mud brick facades patterned with recessed designs. These were palaces for eternity, replicas of royal residences meant to host the ruler's soul in the afterlife. At Saqqara, the necropolis near Memphis, similar innovations appeared. Large rectangular structures known as mastabas, built with precision-cut limestone casing. Inside, false doors were carved to allow the spirit, the Ka, to pass between worlds. The symbolism was clear. Architecture was becoming a bridge between realities. In these designs, one can see the ghost of something greater approaching. The step pyramid, still a century away, but already forming in the imagination of these lost engineers. Archaeologists rarely speak of it, but between the lines of known history lie traces of forgotten experiments, projects that failed, collapsed, or were buried beneath later constructions. At Helwan, foundations of what may have been circular shrines hint at attempts to shape stone in non-rectilinear forms. At El Kab, unfinished cuttings in bedrock suggest that builders were testing methods of levelling and weight distribution. Even at Abydos, strange trenches and partially cut monoliths hint that the engineers were pushing their tools and their courage to the limit. They were scientists in all but name, learning through trial and ruin. Their discoveries, both successes and failures, became the silent textbooks of Imhotep's generation. Stone changed not just Egypt's architecture, but its philosophy. Mud brick buildings could be repaired, stone monuments demanded perfection. A single misaligned block could ruin the structure or the symmetry of meaning. To work in stone required foresight, calculation, and patience measured in decades. The builders began to think not in seasons, but in centuries. This shift transformed Egypt's consciousness. Time itself became architectural. Dynasties would come and go, but the monuments would remain, a physical embodiment of immortality. For the first time in human history, a culture decided that the act of building was more important than the lifespan of the builder. Yet even as Egypt stepped into its Stone Age, some mysteries refused to fit neatly into the timeline. At Gebel el-Arak, an ivory knife handle from around 3300 BCE shows a Mesopotamian-style figure in combat. An image carved with microscopic precision, using techniques advanced even by later standards. At Aswan, Blocks show circular drill marks centuries before mechanical drills are supposed to exist. And beneath the step pyramid at Saqqara, tunnels extend in labyrinthine precision, their straightness uncanny. Could the engineers of early Egypt have inherited fragments of a more ancient knowledge? Techniques passed down from a forgotten age, perhaps survivors of a civilization lost in the cataclysms of the late Ice Age? We cannot say. But the evidence suggests this. Progress in Egypt was not a slow climb, but a sudden awakening. Between the mud of Nagada and the stone of Saqqara stands a generation of craftsmen who have no names, only fingerprints. They bridged two worlds, one soft and mortal, one hard and eternal. They were not dreamers, they were translators, turning the memory of clay into the permanence of rock. Every chisel mark was a syllable in a new language, the language of monumentality. Their work laid the foundation for the genius who would come next. Imhotep, the high priest, physician, and architect of the first pyramid. But even his innovations were echoes of their experiments, perfected, not invented. They were the lost engineers, builders whose names vanished, yet whose equations still stand beneath every column of Egypt. Today, under the burning light of Saqqara, fragments of their work still glimmer. The surfaces are worn, the inscriptions faint, but the precision remains. Touching the stone, you can feel the pulse of an intelligence as deliberate as it was ancient. It is not the work of gods, but of men. Men who believed that through order they could speak to eternity. They succeeded. For 5,000 years their walls have outlasted empires. Their geometry has outshone decay. In every cut, in every alignment, in every shadow, their presence endures. The quiet legacy of those who turned the earth itself into architecture. Before the world knew pyramids, Egypt had already discovered its soul, hidden in stone, waiting to be remembered. Every wall ever raised in Egypt points to heaven, not by chance but by design. Before the age of pyramids, before kings carved their names into granite, the builders of Egypt had already discovered something far greater than architecture, geometry as a reflection of divinity. They were no longer just engineers, they were interpreters of the cosmos. In Egypt, geometry was not a science, it was a faith. Each measurement was a prayer. Each proportion, a covenant between earth and sky. To draw a line was to imitate creation itself, the moment when Atum rose from the waters of chaos and divided the infinite into form. The Nile provided the rhythm, but the heavens gave the map. The early Egyptians watched the stars and saw patterns, the belt of Orion rising over the horizon, the path of Sirius, the tilt of the Milky Way mirroring the curve of their river. They did not build randomly. They built in dialogue with these celestial alignments, anchoring heaven to earth through design. Even before the first pyramid, the concept of as above, so below was alive. The belief that the visible world must mirror the divine order of the unseen. Archaeologists have long noted the astronomical precision of Old Kingdom monuments, but the roots of that precision reach far deeper. At Abydos, tombs from the first dynasty are oriented toward the northern stars, the realm of the imperishable, those that never set. At Hierakonpolis, ceremonial structures align with the rising sun. And at Nagada, circular sanctuaries follow the seasonal movement of Sirius, marking the time of the annual flood. Even simple villages were laid out with celestial intent. The doorways of homes often faced east, welcoming dawn. Courtyards were placed to capture sunlight at specific times of year. In these quiet alignments, the Egyptians practiced cosmic architecture on the scale of daily life. Their temples, tombs, and cities were not built upon the land. They were inscribed upon it. Long before Pythagoras, before Euclid, there was Egypt, and within its stones lay mathematics disguised as mystery. The ratio between width and height in early mastabas, roughly 5.8, mirrors the harmonic progression found later in the Great Pyramid. The ground plans of Abydos' enclosures form rectangles with ratios close to 2.3, reflecting aesthetic principles that would persist for millennia. Even in Nagada pottery and ceremonial palettes, the same proportional logic emerges: spirals, circles, and grids arranged with uncanny mathematical symmetry. It is as if the builders already understood that beauty is not decoration but structure, that the universe itself is a geometry of harmony. To them, these proportions were not formulas, they were mantras, sacred repetitions of cosmic order. In pre-dynastic art, geometry and myth were one. The benben, the primordial mound of creation, was represented as a pyramidion, a small triangular form rising from chaos. The jed pillar, symbol of stability, mirrored the form of architectural columns. The ankh, symbol of life, was the key-shaped design used in the thresholds of tombs. Each of these sacred icons originated as both concept and construction, ideas made physical. In this way, architecture became scripture. Walls were verses, columns were prayers. Every proportion told a story of balance, between day and night, life and death, the seen and the unseen. When later temples carved these symbols in stone, they were not inventing, they were inheriting. Around 3200 BCE, as the two lands unified, Egypt's builders began encoding their geography into sacred design. The Nile was imagined as the Milky Way, the sky's reflection on earth. The south, where the river's source lay hidden, was the realm of the gods. The north, where it opened to the sea, was the realm of man. To rule both was to unite heaven and earth. This cosmology translated directly into architecture. Temples faced east to greet the solar rebirth, tombs faced west to follow the sun's descent into the underworld, and the king, standing between them, became the axis mundi, the living pillar connecting the two worlds. In this cosmic geometry, every structure was a diagram of the universe. To enter a temple was to walk through creation itself, from outer chaos to inner light, from human space to divine presence. The architecture did not imitate the cosmos, it recreated it. New studies of early Egyptian sites reveal another layer of sophistication: the use of acoustic and optical geometry. At Abydos and Saqqara, narrow corridors and angled chambers amplify sound, creating harmonic resonances at specific frequencies. At sunrise, the shafts of light penetrate inner sanctuaries at calculated moments, illuminating altars or symbols within. These effects were not accidents, they were deliberate manipulations of space, light, and sound, designed to evoke the experience of the divine. The builders had discovered that architecture could speak not in words, but in vibration. This marriage of geometry and energy would reach perfection in the great temples of later dynasties, yet its roots trace back to the pre-dynastic engineers who first realized that stone could sing. Every pre-dynastic architect was also an astronomer. They tracked the stars not for navigation, but for revelation. The nightly procession of constellations became a celestial calendar, the foundation of agriculture, ritual, and governance. At Nabta Playa, far south in the Nubian desert, a ring of megaliths dating to 4800 BCE aligns precisely with the rising of Sirius and Orion's belt. Though predating dynastic Egypt, it reveals the same symbolic grammar: circular design, solar alignment, and astronomical precision. Perhaps these southern skywatchers were Egypt's elder cousins, the first to encode time into stone. By the time of Nagada III, the concept of architectural alignment had matured into state ideology. To measure the heavens was to measure destiny, and in that act, humanity found its reflection in the stars. Why geometry? Because geometry was the only language that never lied. It transcended tribe, era, and tongue. It was eternal as the gods it described. In carving proportion into stone, The early Egyptians sought not beauty, but truth. To them, symmetry was justice, balance was morality, harmony was divinity. The architect was therefore not a builder, but a priest of order, a servant of Maat. Through geometry they made the invisible visible, the structure of the cosmos mapped into the human world. Each temple, each tomb, each wall became a bridge between finite and infinite. Thousands of years later, Greek philosophers would come to Egypt seeking this knowledge. Plato, Pythagoras, and Herodotus all wrote of Egyptian geometry as the foundation of Western thought. But what they encountered was already ancient, a wisdom inherited, not invented. Even today, mathematicians marvel at the geometric continuity of Egyptian monuments. From the layout of Abydos to the angles of the Great Pyramid, from the ratios of Karnak's columns to the acoustics of Dendera, the same harmonic principles endure. The code was never lost, only misunderstood. It was not about numbers, it was about relationship, the balance between opposites, the echo between heaven and earth. Every civilization remembers a name, the one who gave it form. For Egypt, that name is Imhotep, the sage, the healer, the high priest, the builder of the first pyramid. But legends often begin at the end of a story, and Imhotep may not have invented Egypt's architecture. He may have remembered it. Around 2650 BCE, during the reign of King Djoser, Imhotep rose from obscurity to divine status. He designed the step pyramid of Saqqara, the first monumental structure built entirely of stone, 6 mastabas stacked upon one another, forming a staircase to the heavens. It was not merely a tomb, it was a resurrection machine, a ladder for the soul. Ancient texts call Imhotep the one who comes in peace, the son of Ptah, and the master of sculptors. In later centuries, he would be deified, worshipped as the god of wisdom and medicine, identified by the Greeks with Asclepius. But behind the mythology lies a man, an architect who somehow knew how to turn soft limestone into living geometry. The question is, how? Imhotep did not emerge from nothing. His genius stands atop centuries of experimentation, the work of countless artisans and engineers whose names time forgot. To understand him, we must look backward, through the dust of dynasties, to the quiet hands that prepared the way. At Saqqara, Imhotep took the shape of the mastaba, the traditional tomb of the first and second dynasties, and expanded it beyond precedent. He didn't change its essence, he multiplied it. Layer upon layer, he built 6 terraces of stone, each one echoing the rectangular mud-brick tombs of Abydos and Hierakonpolis. The result was not innovation, but evolution, a vertical translation of a much older horizontal language. The palace facade motif along its base, the recessed walls first seen at Abydos, reappears here, perfected in limestone. The surrounding funerary complex, with its courtyards, shrines and false chapels, mirrors the ceremonial enclosures of early kings. Even its alignment to the north mirrors the celestial orientation of pre-dynastic tombs. Imhotep's genius was not invention, it was remembrance, an act of restoration on a grand scale. Archaeological studies show that Imhotep's construction techniques did not appear suddenly. The use of cut limestone blocks, plumb line levelling, and north-south orientation can all be traced to earlier dynastic tombs. At Abydos, under the sands of el-Ka'ab, fragments of stone architecture from the reigns of Den and Jet reveal the same joinery and alignment principles later used at Saqqara. Even the layout of Djoser's complex, a massive rectangular enclosure with a central monument and ritual courtyards, bears striking similarity to the Shunet el-Zabib at Abydos, built a century before. It is as if Imhotep had studied their ruins, measured their lines, and resurrected their spirit in stone. Was he guided by ancient blueprints, perhaps carved into temple walls or encoded in oral tradition? Or did he simply listen to the geometry beneath his feet, to the rhythm of proportions already buried in Egypt's collective memory. If Imhotep was the first named architect, then his teachers were the unnamed engineers of Nagada and Abydos, the lost lineage that bridged clay and stone. They perfected the art of alignment, the craft of weight and counterweight, the secrets of proportion. Through centuries of refinement, their knowledge became ritual, preserved not in books, but in practice. Each apprentice learned by imitation, tracing ropes, leveling sand, measuring shadow. Techniques passed not through language, but through repetition. By the time Imhotep was born, he inherited a tradition already thousands of years old, a guild of sacred builders, each generation polishing the past like a mirror. Perhaps this is why the step pyramid feels both revolutionary and ancient, because it was both. It was the culmination of a memory. Egyptian legend tells that architecture was taught to humanity by Thoth, the god of wisdom, the keeper of sacred measure. He was said to have invented writing, mathematics, and the arts of construction. Imhotep, as high priest of Ptah, was seen as Thoth's earthly reflection, the mortal who could read the geometry of the gods. But Thoth's wisdom was never written plainly. It was hidden in proportion, encoded in stone. The ratios of Djoser's pyramid, 11:9, 14:11, mirror not arbitrary choices, but harmonic values found in nature. The same principles later known as the golden section. Such precision suggests not experimentation, but continuity, knowledge inherited, refined, and sanctified. To Imhotep, geometry was not calculation, it was communication. Every angle, every axis, every shadow spoke to the divine. He built not as a man reaching for the heavens, but as one remembering how heaven had once touched the earth. Imhotep may have led the design, but the step pyramid's construction demanded a vast army of specialists, masons, surveyors, sculptors, and priests, all working from a unified plan. Among them must have been the last descendants of the pre-dynastic guilds, the bearers of methods passed from the days of Nagada and Hierakonpolis. Their fingerprints survive in small details, the alternating brick and stone foundations, the precision of levelling across hundreds of metres, the use of limestone casing blocks shaped with complex interlocks to resist erosion. Even today, modern engineers struggle to explain the logistics, how such accuracy was achieved without metal tools, pulleys, or wheels. Yet the answer lies not in lost machines, but in accumulated experience, thousands of years of humans learning how to make the earth obey their sense of balance. Between Abydos and Saqqara lies a gap in history, a silence of perhaps 2 centuries. Few records, few monuments, and fewer explanations. It is as though Egypt paused, waiting to remember itself. Some archaeologists see this as a time of consolidation. Others, as a loss, a period when much of Egypt's earliest knowledge may have vanished, preserved only in fragments of oral lore. Could it be that Imhotep's brilliance was not an awakening, but a revival? The final re-emergence of a tradition nearly lost to sand and time? Ancient texts hint at such cycles. In the Temple of Edfu inscriptions composed millennia later, priests speak of a first time, Zep Tepi, when the gods built the first temples before the flood. Those ancient blueprints, they said, were rediscovered by later kings, guiding their reconstructions. To the priests of Egypt, the architecture of the past was not forgotten, merely sleeping. Perhaps Imhotep's step pyramid was one such awakening, a reanimation of the divine plan. The genius of Imhotep was not only technical, it was spiritual. He understood that stone alone cannot defy time, only meaning can. So he built symbolism into structure. The 6 tiers of the pyramid represented the 6 stages of ascension, the transformation from man to star. The subterranean chambers mirrored the womb of the earth, the birthplace of eternity. And the temple's open courts reflected the sky, where the king's spirit would rise as the sun. In every detail, the architecture encoded cosmology. It was theology made tangible, a machine for resurrection. And that concept too was ancient. Its roots stretch back to the first tombs of Abydos, where kings once sailed the celestial river in boats of wood and faith. There are whispers among Egyptologists, quiet, cautious, never published too loudly, that the step pyramid is too advanced for its supposed time. The precision, the engineering, the scale, all seem to leap forward as if from nowhere. How did a civilization within a single generation move from brick to megalith? Some suspect that Imhotep's designs were not innovations at all, but reconstructions of something older. Legends speak of lost texts in the libraries of Heliopolis, scrolls describing temples that existed before the first sunrise. No such documents survive, but perhaps their blueprints do, buried beneath later monuments, encoded in alignments, preserved in myth. If so, Imhotep was not the first builder. He was the last translator, the man who spoke the forgotten language of stone. Imhotep's influence outlived dynasties. Every pyramid that followed, from Meidum to Giza, bears his fingerprint. Every architect of the Old Kingdom traced their lineage to his genius, though few understood how deep that lineage truly ran. Thousands of years later, when the Greeks came to Egypt, they called him Imhotep the Wise. They built temples to him, seeking cures, not monuments. Even in the age of empire his legend endured, proof that true architecture outlives empire itself. And yet behind his divinity there is a human story, the story of memory, of a man who stood at the threshold of the known world and looked backward instead of forward, who turned dust into eternity, not by discovering, but by remembering. Imhotep did not build Egypt's first pyramid. He rebuilt Egypt's first memory. No civilization rises in isolation. Even the Nile, eternal as it seems, flows from elsewhere. So too did the ideas that shaped its stones. When we look beyond Egypt's horizon, across deserts, seas, and forgotten continents, we begin to see patterns. Not coincidences, but correspondences. Not imitation, but resonance. As if the builders of Egypt were remembering something humanity once knew and lost. From the temples of Egypt to the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, from the cities of the Indus to the pyramids of the Americas, one truth repeats. Geometry connects them all. Step pyramids, recessed facades, solar alignments, sacred ratios, all appear independently yet identically. The further we look back, the clearer the symmetry becomes. Long before writing, long before borders, humanity was already building in harmony with the same cosmic blueprint. It's as if the earth itself had whispered the same design to every people who listened. Archaeology calls it convergent development. But what if it was something else? Convergent memory. Across the desert from Egypt, the cities of Uruk, Eridu, and Ur were rising beside the Tigris and Euphrates. Their temples, ziggurats, were step towers aligned to the heavens, built in layered platforms of brick and bitumen. Each tier represented a level of the cosmos: underworld, earth, sky. Their very names echoed Egypt's language of ascent. The earliest, at Eridu, dates to around 5000 BCE, centuries before Egypt's unification. It began as a single platform, rebuilt again and again, layer upon layer, much like the mastebus that predated Djoser's pyramid. And in Uruk's temple of Anu, archaeologists found decorative facades with the same recessed pattern seen at Abydos and Saqqara, separated by over 1,000 kilometers, yet built as if from the same memory. Trade between these regions was real. Lapis from Afghanistan reached both Sumer and Egypt, but trade alone cannot explain the shared symbolic architecture. Both saw the temple as the axis of creation, both aligned to the stars, both used the same stepped geometry to ascend toward the divine. It was not imitation, it was parallel remembrance. Farther east in the Indus Valley, cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa appeared almost overnight around 2600 BCE. Their brickwork was standardized, their streets laid in perfect grids aligned to cardinal directions, their drainage systems more advanced than those of later Rome. The builders there used the same 1:4 proportional bricks that appear in early Egyptian mastabas. Coincidence or continuity? Seals from the Indus show symbols, eyes, serpents, stepped shrines, hauntingly familiar to motifs carved on Egyptian ivory. And like the Nile, the Indus was both a river and a calendar, its floods dictating the rhythm of life and architecture alike. Two civilizations, separated by thousands of miles, yet both guided by water, stars, and symmetry. Recent genetic and trade studies suggest contact between these regions through the Arabian Gulf and Red Sea routes. Copper from Oman, lapis from Badakhshan, carnelian from Gujarat, all appear in Egyptian tombs from the 1st and 2nd dynasties. But along with goods, ideas travel too. Perhaps the geometry of the Indus, its obsession with order, measurement, and flow, found reflection in the engineers of the Nile. Or perhaps both were inheriting a common heritage older than either river. South of Egypt lies Nubia, land of dark stone and endless horizon. Here too, ancient builders raised step structures, small pyramids with sharp angles and aligned doorways. Though built later in history, their foundations trace older patterns, ones that predate even the early Egyptian dynasties. Archaeological layers at Kerma reveal walled cities with brick vaults and radial layouts strikingly similar to Hierakonpolis. In Nabta Playa, farther west in the Nubian desert, megalithic circles from 4800 BCE align perfectly with the rising of Sirius and Orion's belt, the same celestial markers that guided Egyptian temples thousands of years later. These sites suggest that southern Egypt and Nubia were not separate cultures, but part of a shared horizon, a continuum of knowledge flowing northward, carried by traders, shepherds, and priests who followed the stars across the sands. If true, then the architects of Egypt may have been heirs to an African legacy as old as time itself. And yet the echoes do not stop at Africa's edge. Across the Atlantic, in places the Egyptians never reached, we find the same geometry written in stone. In Caral, Peru, dated to 2600 BCE, pyramidal platforms rise in stepped terraces aligned to solstices. In La Venta, Mexico, builders aligned colossal heads and plazas to magnetic north with a precision rivaling Giza. And in Tiahuanaco, Bolivia, megalithic blocks bear interlocking joints and drill-like precision eerily reminiscent of early Egyptian masonry. No contact, no trade, no shared language, only the same obsession, order, alignment, and the transformation of Earth into eternity. Archaeologists dismiss the parallels as coincidence, but coincidences that repeat across oceans and millennia begin to look less like chance and more like echoes of a forgotten paradigm. If these civilizations were not directly connected, could they have drawn from a shared source, an ancestral knowledge carried from the world before the flood? Ancient myths speak of such memory. In Mesopotamia, the Oans, a being from the sea, taught humans architecture and writing after a great deluge. In Egypt, Thoth preserved sacred geometry in the House of Life until the world was ready again. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, arrived from across the ocean to teach calendar and craft. Different names, same story. Beings of wisdom emerging after catastrophe, restoring the arts of building, writing, and order. Myth, perhaps, but myth often hides the residue of memory. Could it be that what we call civilization is not a beginning, but a reconstruction, a recovery from a forgotten golden age? If so, then Egypt's architects were not the first builders, but the first restorers. Across continents, ancient monuments share key traits. 1. Astronomical alignment, Orion, Sirius, solstices, equinoxes. 2. Sacred proportions, the golden ratio, 3t to 4 to 5 triangles, harmonic progressions. 3. Cyclopean precision, blocks fitted with tolerances of millimeters. 4. Ritual geometry, steps, circles, and axes mirroring cosmic order. These were not coincidences of culture, they were constants of consciousness, a universal grammar of form that transcended geography. Perhaps, somewhere deep in humanity's collective memory, these principles survived the upheavals of the last ice age, whispered from one coast to another, passed through migration, encoded in myth, reawakened wherever humans looked up and saw the same stars. The builders of Egypt, Sumer, and the Indus may never have met, yet they all built the same dream, a geometry of remembrance. Knowledge moves in silence. It does not travel as armies do, but as stories, as rituals, as numbers hidden in songs. Every culture had its priests of measure, those who guarded proportion, star paths, and sacred calendars. When civilizations rose, these keepers became architects. When they fell, they became myths. In Egypt, they were the followers of Thoth. In Sumer, the scribes of Enki. In India, the rishis of cosmic measure. In the Andes, the watchers of Inti. Each claimed to have inherited their craft from an age before memory. Their temples were not separate works, but chapters of one story. Humanity's attempt to rebuild the lost symmetry between heaven and earth. Among the boldest theories stands one as old as Plato, that before these civilizations there existed a mother culture, an advanced world destroyed by flood and time. Atlantis, not a single city, but a network of knowledge, erased yet remembered. Plato's account places its fall around 9600 BCE, coinciding with the end of the Younger Dryas, when cataclysmic floods swept the globe. As glaciers melted and sea levels rose by hundreds of feet, coastal civilizations vanished, their ruins now buried beneath oceans. Could the survivors of that catastrophe have carried fragments of their science across the world, seeding Egypt, Sumer, and the Indus with the memory of proportion, alignment, and celestial order? No proof endures, only patterns. But patterns, when repeated enough, begin to form a code. Whether or not such a mother culture existed, one truth remains. The builders of the ancient world were listening to the same frequency. Across thousands of miles, they tuned their monuments to the heavens, carved their myths in the same mathematical key, and expressed divinity through geometry. Egypt was their most perfect echo, the place where the memory solidified into stone. Every civilization has a story of beginnings, but Egypt's story does not start with humans. It begins with memory. The ancient priests of Hierakonpolis spoke of a time before kings, before the Nile rose, before even the gods had names. They called it Zep Tepi, the first time, a sacred epoch when creation itself unfolded, when gods walked among men and knowledge descended from the stars or the deep. To the Egyptians, Zep Tepi was not myth, it was history, the first history, the one that shaped all others, and they left clues to it in stone. Zep Tepi was said to occur when the world emerged from the waters of chaos. Atum, the self-created one, rose upon the primordial mound, the Benben, and from him came order, measure, and form. The sky was lifted, the earth solidified, and the first temples were built according to the design of heaven. To modern ears, it is mythology, but to the ancient Egyptians, it was engineering, the moment when divine geometry entered the world. Every temple, every monument, every sacred axis of Egypt was said to be modelled upon those plans of the gods. The priests called them divine blueprints, kept within the House of Life, a mysterious archive said to contain the original maps of creation, the first architectural code. What if that code was real? What if the first time was not an age of gods, but an age of builders? A civilization so ancient its ruins have become the bedrock of myth. Many ancient cultures share the same memory: a great flood, a rebirth, and the return of wisdom. In Mesopotamia, the sages of Awakens emerged from the sea to teach geometry and writing. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha rebuilt humanity after the deluge. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl brought architecture and calendar knowledge to the survivors. And in Egypt, the gods of Zep-Tepi rebuilt the world upon the Benben stone, a sacred peak rising above the waters. Science now tells us that around 12,000 years ago, at the end of the Younger Dryas, the world truly did drown. Sea levels rose more than 120 meters. Ice caps melted in violent pulses. Continents shifted. Entire coastlines and any civilization along them vanished beneath the sea. Could Zep-Tepi be the Egyptian memory of that global cataclysm? A time when survivors carried fragments of knowledge, astronomy, engineering, geometry, and rebuilt it along safer rivers like the Nile. Perhaps Egypt was not the beginning of civilization. Perhaps it was the recovery. Texts from the temples of Edfu, Dendera, and Philae speak of a mysterious order known as the Shebtu, the followers of Horus. They were described as semi-divine beings, architects and astronomers, who came from the island of the egg after the flood, bringing with them the plans of the temples of the gods. Their leader was called Thoth, the keeper of measure, the one who rebuilt the world in accordance with the sacred numbers. In these stories, the followers of Horus travelled across Egypt, re-establishing sacred sites upon the foundations of the first time. They built the first shrines at Abydos, Hierakonpolis, and Giza, each aligned to celestial markers that may predate Egypt's own dynasties by thousands of years. Within the House of Life, priests guarded these divine blueprints, diagrams, measurements, and star maps inscribed on papyrus or carved into temple walls. They were not myths, they were manuals, records of how to rebuild the cosmos in stone. The code of Zep-Tepi was geometric. The circle symbolized eternity, the square, the earth, the triangle, ascension. When combined, they formed the pyramid, the meeting of heaven and earth. The ratios found in Egypt's earliest monuments reflect harmonic numbers linked to planetary motion and stellar cycles. The 3-4-5 triangle of Pythagoras appears in Old Kingdom design centuries before Greece. The 11.7 slope ratio of pyramids mirrors the constant of solar elevation at Giza's latitude, and the golden proportion, 1:618, appears in temple layouts long before it was named. These were not random choices. They were cosmic constants, mathematical reflections of creation itself. The priests believed that to build according to these numbers was to resonate with the structure of the universe, to make the temple a living part of the cosmic body. Every wall, every corridor, every altar was a harmonic note in a vast architectural symphony. This is why Egypt's monuments endure. They were not designed to impress the eye. They were designed to survive entropy, to echo the universe's own geometry. Across Egypt, certain locations were revered as primordial mounds, physical links to Zep-Tepi. Each was a site where, according to tradition, the gods first raised land from chaos. At Heliopolis, the Benben stone stood within the temple of Ra, the point where the first light touched the earth. At Abydos, the mound of Osiris marked the place where life and death first intertwined. At Giza, the plateau was said to mirror the stars of Orion's belt, the celestial realm of Osiris himself. These sites form a triangle across Egypt's map, a deliberate alignment that scholars still debate. But to the priests, it represented the 3 stages of creation: birth, Heliopolis; death, Abydos; and rebirth, Giza, a sacred geometry of the soul. In this network of temples and stars, Egypt recreated the cosmos on Earth, a world rebuilt in remembrance of the first time. If Zep-Tepi was the age of the gods, then the Old Kingdom was their echo, the second time. The builders who raised the Step Pyramid, the temples of Saqqara, and the great monuments of Giza saw themselves not as innovators, but as restorers of the divine design. Inscriptions describe pharaohs as those who renew the works of the ancestors. The pyramids were not symbols of power, they were acts of restoration, attempts to reactivate a forgotten resonance between man, earth, and sky. To the Egyptians, each act of building was a ritual of remembrance, a way to bring Zep-Tepi back to life, to make time itself fold. The cycle would continue endlessly, order rising from chaos, geometry from dust, life from stone. Modern researchers have uncovered alignments that suggest Egypt's architects were preserving a memory far older than their own era. The Orion correlation theory, proposed by Robert Bauval, points out that the three main pyramids of Giza align precisely with the stars of Orion's belt, as they would have appeared around 10,500 BCE, the exact period many traditions associate with the Great Flood. At the same time, the Sphinx faces due east, greeting the rising sun at the spring equinox, when the constellation of Leo, the lion, ruled the sky. Together they mark a snapshot in time, a cosmic date carved in stone. Could these alignments be intentional? If so, they were not built to honor the present, but to remember the past, to mark the return of the builders of Zep-Tepi. Over time, the knowledge of the first time faded. Wars, droughts, and dynastic upheavals fractured the priesthood. The blueprints were copied, reinterpreted, simplified, until sacred architecture became ritual architecture, stripped of its harmonic core. Yet echoes remained. Even in the late temples of Dendera and Edfu, the priests still spoke of the primeval ones, the first architects who measured the earth with cords of fire and raised the heavens with perfect angles. Aki, they called themselves those who build in the image of the first time. They remembered, faintly, that they were imitating something that once was. If the monuments of Egypt are indeed coded with the memory of Zep-Tepi, then they are more than relics. They are messages, time capsules meant for future awakenings. Their alignments, ratios, and symbols may form a language not yet fully understood, a conversation across millennia between the builders and those who would one day rediscover their design. Perhaps the ancients knew that civilizations rise and fall, that knowledge erodes, but that stone endures. And so they built for us, for the next cycle, the next remembering. Every era has its own first time. Ours may simply be the next one. Every civilization leaves behind a shadow, but Egypt's shadow is light, carved into eternity, mirrored in stone, and still alive in us. From the clay villages of Nagada to the terraces of Saqqara and the luminous plains of Giza, one thread endures: memory. Not the memory of kings, but of builders, those who first turned thought into form and made the universe stand still long enough to be measured. Their names are lost, yet their rhythm remains in every line of symmetry, every ratio of balance, every sunrise that strikes the Sphinx. To them, architecture was not invention, but remembrance, a way to preserve harmony when the world forgot it. Each temple, each pyramid, each block of stone was a sentence in a language older than words, the geometry of consciousness made visible. Even now, we still build in their image. Every bridge, every tower, every dream of permanence is their echo, proof that the first architects never vanished. They became the foundation beneath our feet, the instinct in our hands, the rhythm in our cities. We are the continuation of their design. The story of Egypt was never about stone. It was about the human desire to remember, to reach for eternity through creation. Perhaps that is why when we stand before the Great Pyramid or the silent ruins of Abydos, we feel something deeper than awe. It is recognition. Some part of us remembers the measure. Somewhere within, the geometry of the first time still sleeps, waiting to be rebuilt. If this journey reminded you that history is not only what we know, but what we've forgotten, then subscribe, stay curious, and join us as we continue uncovering the worlds that time tried to erase.